Steve Tyler, and challenger Constance Philly Johnson on my left. I want to thank both of the candidates for agreeing to participate. This is what democracy is all about, so we appreciate that very much. We've agreed on the format ahead of time. We're going to have 1 minute for each candidate for opening and closing statements, and then each candidate will get a series of, well, a total of 6 questions. Same candidates will get the same question. Each will get 2 minutes to respond to the question, and then there'll be 1 minute time for rebuttal to those questions. The order of the questions was determined by a coin toss. Mr. Tyler won the toss, will get the first question. After that, the order of the questions will alternate. For opening statements, we're going to allow the incumbent to go first, and for closing statements, the challenger will go first. So we'll start with Mr. Tyler delivering his opening statement. Again, I want to thank you all for participating. And you, Mr. Tyler.
Thank you, and I thank the advocate, the chamber, and all those in attendance. Who am I? I'm the criminal district attorney. I represent you in the district court and all lower courts. I represent the commissioners, and I advise the commissioners. I am the experienced candidate for criminal district attorney. My opponent has tried, or prosecuted rather, 0 cases. I have prosecuted 108 cases in Victoria County, 94 of them felony cases, with a 94% conviction rate. I have 34 murder, attempted murder, or engaging cases. Who am I? With law enforcement, I'm the guy that scattered the gangs here in Victoria. When I took office, Victoria was evaluated as the 9th most dangerous municipality in the United States. In July of this year, Texas Monthly said we're one of the 4 safest, in that we have a 10% or higher reduction in crime. It is now at the lowest rate on the Uniform Crime Report since 1985. I believe the purpose of the DA's office is to enforce the laws and thereby protect our community. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Constance Philly Johnson, and I want to earn your vote for Criminal District Attorney of Victoria County. I was born and raised right here in Victoria. I graduated from Victoria High School, Victoria College, and the University of Houston, Victoria, with a degree in education. I was a classroom teacher here in Victoria before becoming a safe and drug-free schools coordinator for Region 3. In that capacity, I implemented drug and violence prevention programs in 40 school districts throughout South Texas. In 2003, I went back to law school, graduated top of my class in December 2005, and came right back home to practice criminal law with my dad, George Philly, and one of my sisters, Tina Marwick. I've also had the distinct pleasure of serving 2 terms as your municipal court judge for the city of Victoria. I want to implement policies in your district attorney's office that reduce employee turnover, number 1, that better serve your taxpayer dollars, and that work together with law enforcement, other agencies, and local treatment providers. I look forward to serving you, and I wholeheartedly believe that by working together, we can do better for Victoria County. Thank you.
All right, thank you. We'll go into the questions. Now, the first question is for Mr. Tyler. Again, the second question that we'll ask for Mr. Johnson, and then there'll be time for rebuttal. The first question is a 2-part question. Are special court probation programs, such as the DWI program used by both county courts of law, effective in reducing recidivism with defendants? Should these specialty programs also be used for veterans, for those who suffer from mental health problems, or for those with drug addiction?
Thank you. First is, when you implement a program, there's 4 things you need to do. Is there a need? Is there an effective result? Does it do what you intended to do? And is it efficient? I don't care whether it's local tax dollars, grant money is typically tax money as well. And lastly, does the court maintain objectivity? Because the people's confidence in the judicial system requires a judge to be objective, not friendly with a defendant. Now, the DWI program, the first issue is, does it produce the results that I produced? A 4% reduction in DWI 1s, a 12% reduction in second-time DWIs, a 42% reduction in third DWIs, and a 33% reduction in homicide resulting from intoxication. My program was to have consequences for those who break the law. My job is to enforce the law and to modify behavior. Typically, you modify behavior by visiting a consequence on the wrongdoer. My job is to vindicate the victims and protect the community, not make defendants comfortable. Lastly, with all specialty courts, you have to be concerned about the objectivity of the judge. The advocate ran a story. I know I was interviewed or given questions on Friday before the story ran, and I provided 2 pages, 2.5 pages in responses. It was much more than a half sentence that was in the newspaper. One of the things that's of particular concern is the objectivity of the court. They interviewed a Mr. Garrett. Mr. Garrett admits to not being involved in the DWI drinking program, not having completed it. That would be a violation. Is the court too friendly with the defendant? Objectivity of the court is important in the criminal justice system.
I'll repeat the question for you. Our special court probation program, such as the DWI program used by both county courts of law, effective in reducing recidivism with defendants, should these specialty programs also be used for veterans, for those who suffer from mental health problems, or for those with drug addiction?
Thank you, Bruce. I fully embrace specialty courts. I think they are effective, the research bears that out, and they are an investment of taxpayer dollars. Investing in underlying issues that defendants face to prevent recidivism is a good investment of taxpayer dollars. Our DWI court is an effective program. I was a founding member of that court in 2008. I've volunteered my services to that court for the last 10 years, and our judges are not friendly with the probationers. They're tough. Specialty courts provide high-intensity supervision while holding people accountable for their actions by addressing underlying issues to prevent recidivism. I will continue to embrace the DWI court as your elected district attorney. We will take our seat at the table, if you will, that Mr. Tyler has not participated in that court since his policy on DWI trials. And I fully embrace exploring the opportunity to initiate other specialty courts. Veterans courts and mental health treatment are absolutely necessary, and I think they're a good investment of your taxpayer dollars and community resources.
Okay, so each candidate gets time for 1 minute to follow.
Funny that the advocate would use Mr. Garrett as an example. He had violations by not being involved or enrolling in a treatment program. The rehabilitation she touted, he wasn't revoked. There was no motion for revocation because there's no violation report. A license to practice law is quite different than a license to counsel or a license to counsel treatment for addictions. There is something unusual about a person who violates that has no consequences. There is something unusual about all the diversion programs and the studies she cited. If you go to the Dallas DA's race, those studies are funded by the ACLU. The ACLU wants to avoid consequences to defendants. They want to make the defendants comfortable. The job of the DA is to enforce the laws and make you safe, not defendants comfortable.
Okay, 1 minute rebuttal for you.
Thank you, sir. If Mr. Tyler or anyone from his office actually attended DWI court, he would know that Mr. Garrett had a genuine misunderstanding about the requirements of him. He had completed all of his group counseling sessions, but had not signed up for his individual sessions. That was an issue that we worked out at DWI court. He scheduled a conflict. It's not about Mr. Garrett. It's about numerous people in our community that repeat offend and need to be held to a high accountability standard, but at the same time need some assistance for addressing the underlying issues of their
All right, we'll go on to the next question. This time, Ms. Johnson gets to start. Mr. Tyler created, we're on a similar topic. Mr. Tyler created a policy of requiring all first-time DWI cases to go to trial. This policy is no longer in place. How should the public best determine whether this policy was a success or a failure?
Well, I can tell you that Mr. Tyler has publicly cited his Office of Court Administration numbers as being successful with regard to that policy. His numbers dictate what numbers we're looking
create the question for you, Mr. Tyler. You created a policy requiring all first-time DWI cases to go to trial. This policy is no longer in place. How should the public best determine whether this policy was a success or a failure?
Well, first we need to start with facts. It wasn't the first time DWIs, it was all misdemeanor DWIs. And it was for a 2-year period of time. And what was compared is 1 year before the policy with 1 year after the policy. With the data is sworn to by the county clerks and the district clerks and turned into the Office of Court Administration so that you, the citizens, can see how your courts are working. That data showed a 4% decrease in DWI first, a 12% reduction in DWI seconds, a 42% reduction in DWI thirds, a 33% reduction in homicides related. There was no backlog. That same data, there's 700 less misdemeanors the year after the policy as the year before. And if it's undue pressure on the courts, first I would submit they should practice law instead of counseling. Okay. The second thing about the backlog, they went from having 8 out of 80 possible trial settings a year all the way up to 24. So they went from 10% capacity to 31% capacity. They are not overburdened. In a lot of jurisdictions, county courts of law will hear 3 DWIs a week. A DWI is a day and a half trial. Consequences deter criminal conduct. If a criminal is comfortable, you will get more crime. That is not the purpose of the DA's office. It is to enforce the laws and to protect the community. The data is available to all of you, and that's how it works out. The year before compared to the year after. 700 cases less, and the results that I quoted to you. I might also add, no indication of increased costs. Those defendants will by and large retain. Furthermore, a judge, if they put someone on probation, which is typically what happens in the DWI, they can order repayment of any indigent defense costs.
All right, we've got 1 minute rebuttal for you. Thompson.
Thank you, sir. Again, the OCA only reports the cases that are filed by Mr. Tyler's office. So in a way, he has the opportunity to manipulate that data. The raw numbers are taken from arrest numbers. Your police department, sheriff's department, Department of Public Safety troopers arrested in 2015 237 people for first-time DWIs. In 2016, 190 people. That did drop down. But back up at 2017, 206 people. That's an 11% increase. Clearly did not have the deterrent effect Mr. Tyler had intended. The deterrent for criminal consequences is only available if people know the consequences. I have anecdotal people from people coming to my office after being arrested that didn't have the foggiest idea about what the new DWI policy entailed. So it couldn't possibly have the deterrent effect that it was intended.
All right, 1 minute rebuttal.
She's wrong again. When I would expect that, she's a DWI defense attorney. It did have deterrent effect. She ought to know. She argued that before every jury panel that she lost a case in. It did deter. You have the numbers. Every arrest doesn't rise to probable cause. You have to have that evaluated, and the officer has to swear it out. You have to actually have a case to move forward. It's not simply arrest. She would cut the DA both out of the intake process as well as out of the trial process. The DA is here to enforce the laws and to protect the community, not make criminals comfortable, not make defense attorneys money. That's our job. That's our duty. That's what we're focused on. It had good results, and everybody in the jurisdiction heard about it.
All right, we've got next question. Mr. Tyler gets the question first. Experts say our jails and prisons are the country's largest providers of mental health care. How can we best help residents who suffer from mental illnesses before or when they enter the criminal justice system?
There's really no possible way of answering that in a minute or two. I believe the legislature has been wrangling with that for over a decade. And they meet for a lot longer than we have here. First, it's going to take money. Okay, it's going to take a good bit of money. Because what you're looking at is divert them from incarceration to some kind of treatment, and treatment doesn't come cheap. Psychologists and psychiatrists actually cost more than jailers, okay? And the facilities are quite a bit different than jails. Now, locally, law enforcement and Gulf Bend have talked about a diversion program. But what they use as the first, if you will, the first tier of that are officers to identify who needs treatment. That's probably one of the weaker parts of the system, because officers are trained in probable cause and how to effect an arrest and the use of force. They are not trained to diagnose. Now, we've had several incidents where the magistrate, the arresting officer, the jailers have not noticed people who are mentally ill. We identified them because their mothers, frustrated, came to my office and gave me a good bit more background than I suppose the officers had when they originally made the arrest. And we filed an order or a motion for an order from the magistrate for an immediate evaluation. We have somewhat of a system. To really have a robust system requires the state to fund it and the state to relook at quite a bit of how they handle it. Thank you.
All right. Same question, I'll repeat it. Experts say our jails and prisons are the country's largest provider of mental health care. How can we best help residents who suffer from mental illnesses before or when they enter the criminal justice system?
The state does need to fund it. That's a problem throughout the nation, certainly throughout Texas. The state has funded it. We have been given funding through the Gulf Bend Community Collaborative. Mr. Tyler has been invited to participate in the formation of that entity to help divert nonviolent offenders from jail, and he has not attended any of those meetings. Again, I mentioned it a moment ago, but I think specialty courts and to be proactive rather than reactive is a crucial role for the district attorney. I don't, he's on record saying that those things are given. I respectfully disagree, but I think until we have something better in place, we should embrace what some of the local entities are trying to do to remove that situation. Jail is not the place for nonviolent people with mental illness. We need to do a better job to step up and try to think outside the box until we do have the funding available from the national and state resources.
Right. 1 minute or so.
We don't have anywhere near the resources. It isn't funded. You have basically a Band-Aid for a sucking chest wound. And anybody who knows the issue and is honest would tell you that. Missed meetings because the Office of the Inspector General was doing an investigation of Gulf Bend. And the first line responders are all peace officers. I was fully informed by board members, Raleigh McCoy, as well as my partners, the chief of police and the sheriff, as to what was going on. I might add, we're not currently fully and effectively using the current law. Specialty courts, if there isn't any specialty in the specialty courts, it is a gimmick. A law license is not a license to diagnose or treat. You need to have the appropriate expert, not a police officer diagnosing, not a judge trying to counsel. Then you can have something that's effective. But first, you would have to fund those experts, and there's no such funding currently.
All right. 1 minute or so, Ms. Johnson.
Like it or not, law enforcement officers are the current first responders. And until we have a better system in place, we must support them and equip them with the tools that they need to do the best job that they're able to do under our current system. The money, I hope, in the future will come. Right now it won't. It isn't. But we have to support the efforts that are in place to address those issues in the best way that we can at this moment.
All right. Next question, Ms. Johnson. First, considering the county spends about $1 million on indigent defense each year, how can we reduce those costs for indigent defense?
Some of the indigent defense costs are absolutely out of the control of the district attorney. There are things that every county must embrace to get those costs met. With that said, some of the things that he can control include employee turnover. When you have a revolving door in the criminal district attorney's office, which we have new employees every 3 months, the lack of continuity
Considering the county spends about $1 million on indigent defense each year, how can we reduce those costs?
Well, first is, the actual total for 2018 is $1,112,168. That goes for CPS, that goes for the Attorney General's Court, it goes for juvenile misdemeanor and felony. First is, it has nothing to do with turnover in my office. My office is given one or less resets. The defense takes 3 or 4 or more. She should know, she asks for resets. That's a delay. Now, why would an attorney leave? First, you gotta operate with the resources that you're given. Tax revenues are down because you don't have as much money as you once had. Your commissioners are responsive to that. They say, Steve, can you get the mission done with less? Certainly I will. And we did. We cut $132,000 out of my budget. Now, some of the people from my office are here. A prosecutor gets out of law school, they owe $200,000 to $250,000. Within 30 days of passing the bar, they need to start making payments. They can defer all but the interest payments for 6 months. So 9 months after they're hired, they have to start paying probably more than you do in your mortgage. Now, if you're being paid $56,000 to $65,000 and you went to law school to live a better life, that doesn't seem better. You can't pay for a new car, maybe a suit. You can't do anything but pay rent in an apartment. Now, the big jurisdictions that pay more don't hire brand new attorneys. They use us as a finishing school. Fort Bend County, for example, in 18 months hired 33% of my attorneys. Now, I'm not going to begrudge somebody of success and their dreams. And I think Fort Bend County is doing a smart thing. When you've worked in my office for 9 months, you've tried cases, you're a good prosecutor, you're experienced. How is she going to reduce that unless she hires people who don't want to progress or can't progress?
All right. 1 minute rebuttal here, Ms. Johnson.
Mr. Tyler, since 2007, you've had nearly 3 dozen assistant district attorneys submitted at your door. Since 2014, the failed PWI policy had 20 assistant district attorneys leave your office. More than half of those folks are still here practicing criminal law. If you go to Fort Bend County, a lot of those folks are in the room. Talented, homegrown people with local ties that probably would gladly have continued to work in your office, but for lacking a shared vision with you. So I respectfully disagree with you on that regard. Definitely feel that their turnover rate adds to our indigent defense costs just because of a lack of continuity and the lack of consistent persons in office making decisions leads to more. Yes, I do request reset, so does the state. It's time for me to stop. Thank you.
All right. 1 minute rebuttal, Mr. Tyler.
It's not what she feels, it's what the facts are. You can go and get the names of everybody that worked there. They work over in Fort Bend County, they work in Harris County, they work in other counties that pay better. That's the biggest reason for turnover. It's not about feelings, it's about resources. And they come away with experience. She could say it's a failed policy, but it kept you safe, it reduced the crime. Was it comfortable for defendants? No, but that was by design. Again, if a person wishes to do wrong, you visit a consequence more than what they're comfortable paying. They will either modify their behavior or take their criminal activity somewhere else. That's what a prosecutor does. Enforces the law, protects the community. Thank you.
All right. We'll go on to the next question. Mr. Tyler starts first. How effective was your office's use of forfeiture funds to study the operations of the Regional Juvenile Justice Center? And what do you think of now the center's operations?
Well, I think we've always had good operation, and I think that continues now. Now, I used approximately $140,000 in forfeiture money, meaning it was forfeited from criminals who traffic narcotics or the proceeds from the narcotics through your jurisdiction. Those are discretionary funds that my office can utilize. In fact, we do. We pay 100% of operating costs and 13% of payroll out of it. We paid for that study. Why? Because the commissioners asked me several questions, which I am bound by law to respond to. One, are we the budget authority? Yes, and that was backed up by Allison and Bass out of Austin. Can we set budgets and get involved in the reimbursement rate? What you had was a 72-bed facility with only 11 locals on average in those beds. You were subsidizing Dallas, Harris, San Antonio, and Williamson County. Those are all richer counties than you. Your per capita income is $32,000. Over the years, you had spent $24 million subsidizing other people's juveniles. Now, what did the study do? It gave information to the commissioners and the rate went up. In fact, the study in 1 year alone more than compensated for the cost of the study, criminals' money, and you still have several out years to go. Further part of the study looked at the safety of the facility. Both the county's engineer and architect said it was a life safety hazard. That's important. The juvenile board has to understand when your expert says it's a life safety hazard, were there a fire and a child be harmed by smoke or fire, your liability was unlimited. This county could have been bankrupted. Now, $140,000 to give the tools to the commissioners to make appropriate decisions and work with the juvenile board made this place safer and more affordable for our kids.
All right, I'll repeat the question. How effective was the use of DA forfeiture funds to study the operations of the Regional Juvenile Justice Center? What do you think now of the center's operations?
I was at the Commissioners Court meeting when the results of the $135,000 study was presented. Overwhelmingly, the consultants that were hired by Mr. Tyler said that the information they gathered would have been available with or without their members. That was information that they just accumulated from resources that were already available. Our Juvenile Justice Center is a leader both in this state, in the nation, and internationally. I don't want to speculate about what the circumstances were that led to the use of those monies to study the center. We'll never know, because the advocate did an open records request to get the scope of that study, and Mr. Tyler declined that request. An Attorney General's opinion was sought for that information. They didn't say that the appropriate use of forfeiture funds, but they just said that they weren't going to arbitrate that argument in our county. The rates for daily death rates were already on the horizon to be raised. So it's disingenuous for Mr. Tyler to act as if that study led to that. The study was a peripheral use of time and resources that I don't think was necessary, and I continue to believe in the center and look forward to collaborating with them more extensively.
Again, you don't get to make up your facts. You have a commissioner that will talk just after me, and I'm sure that question will be put to him. Every commissioner said it was useful. Every commissioner said it was useful. Now, she says they were going to fix it. They hadn't since it was built. And you remember in social media, and the sky is falling and all the hyperbole, the tone and the tenor was, Commissioners Court cannot have budget authority over us. Commissioners Court cannot influence us on the rates. And furthermore, we don't care what the engineer or the architect says, we believe it's safe because a fire marshal checked the box. There was no firewall, there was no fire door, there was no smoke evacuation system, there was no contiguous fire retardant system throughout the building. Don't believe me, believe the engineer, believe the architect, and believe your commissioners. And you can go back, and it was on video. You don't get to make it up. Was it efficient use? You ask me, bankruptcy or $140,000 taken from criminals? Every year since then, we have saved more than $140,000. Sounds effective and efficient to me.
All right. 1 minute rebuttal for you, Ms. Johnson.
The local fire marshal, the state fire marshal, said the facility was safe. Obviously, we had some competing experts that had differing opinions, but the fact of the matter is, any center, whether it's a county jail or juvenile detention center, has fixed operating costs. Those costs are going to be present whether or not we have out-of-county participants in the program or not. The Juvenile Justice Center good job of offsetting costs that Victoria County would incur one way or the other. We're a top-notch facility, recognized internationally, and the only person that's making you think the sky is falling is Robert across the table.
All right, we'll move to the final question before closing statements. And again, I want to thank everybody here for coming. The final question is for Ms. Johnson first. Mr. Tyler indicted 4 city officials on perjury charges that later were thrown out by a judge and then dropped by a special prosecutor. How much did this highly publicized 8-year-old case factor into voters' decision-making in the March 6th primary election?
Certainly, there's not specific data that I can refer to. I can only talk to you about anecdotal data. The citizens of this community are tired of what they perceive as vindictive prosecution, period. We incurred a lot of public costs and a lot of time and unnecessary grief going after people that ultimately were not convicted in this county by people, an outside judge and an outside prosecutor that took a fresh look at that situation, had no dog in the fight whatsoever, and decided there was nothing there. And so I respectfully submit to you that it's still fresh on people's minds. I'm going door-to-door visiting with folks, introducing myself, asking for their support, and they're still bringing it up. So that's all I can say about that.
Okay, same question for Mr. Tyler. He indicted 4 city officials on perjury charges that later were thrown out by a judge and then dropped by a special prosecutor. How much did this highly publicized 8-year-old case factor into voters' decision-making in the March 6th primary election?
Okay, well, first here, the facts are wrong. What was prosecuted by a special prosecutor was Mike Radcliffe, who was represented by my adversary and her husband. There was a dismissal from the district judge on the other cases, so that's quite a bit different. What you had was an investigation which was interfered into. If you remember, it went to trial, then there was a mistrial. Council member Hagan had a sworn affidavit, never saw the light of day. There's also a lot of stuff in grand jury that never saw the light of day. The grand jury is made up of citizens just like you, your neighbors. They found probable cause. Now, who has a dog in the fight might be who lived in the community and knew Mike Radcliffe and knew what he was doing. He was reelected 3 terms. Who was the DA? And who represented him when he had the charges against him? Now, I might add, that was the first term. We are now completing the 3rd term. This has been an issue before the voters before. How much does it have to do with anything? As much as Ms. Johnson and her father wants to make it. But you had a problem. You had a sheriff who was accused of having sex with underage kids and people in the jail. You had John Slinger with DPS CID who attempted an investigation. And if you recall from the public documents, you had a chief of police that interfered with that investigation, telling the key witness that he would be killed by myself or John Slinger. All that's in the public record. Do you believe that that might be an interference with an investigation? If you run the witnesses off, and who had a dog in the fight? Who represented the defendant? Thank you.
All right, time for a 1-minute rebuttal.
Mr. Tyler, as you well know, the code of ethics that we all practice in the limits and the things that I can say about that case because I did indeed represent Mr. Radcliffe along with my father, not my husband, in that case. The problem, and that initially led to the involvement of city officials in that case, is not that he had been the sheriff in this county. The problem and the perceived issue was that he worked for you at the time that he was indicted. So let's be real clear about that. Nonetheless, you chose to take charges against the city officials in front of the grand jury. They were indicted. I don't recall anything going to trial. In this trial, I simply respectfully disagree with you on those facts. I do recall a special prosecutor, it has been some time, and an outside judge looked at those cases and decided that there was nothing there. They were dismissed, and the regular public plans were expended.
All right, 1-minute rebuttal.
You don't recall, but you'll make accusations. Radcliffe was put on deferred adjudication for a lesser charge. He served it out in The visiting judge was from San Antonio. So there was a plea of guilty. You don't get to make it up. And most of that is all public record and is clearly available. Now, John Slinger is also available. And you can ask him, was his investigation interfered with when his witness was encouraged to leave the jurisdiction? Terrence Staff might be available as well. As the advocate indicated, he was the victim. I've since convicted him for drug abuse, as he has a terrible problem. Now, you can't run from that. You can't just kick up dirt in mud and then run away from it. You represented the wrongdoer. That I didn't cover up, I indicted him.
All right. We'll move to opening, or to closing statements. Oh, did I miss you?
Yes, sir.
Sorry, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I don't believe the advocate ever mentioned the young man's name because at the time he was an alleged victim of sexual offense crime. So it's highly regrettable that Mr. Tyler didn't mention that, but whatever. The fact of the matter is, a fresh set of outside eyes took a look at those cases. We indicted our mayor, our police chief, a very respected police lieutenant, and our city attorney. And then after all of that, fresh eyes without a dog in the fight said there's nothing here. We spent our time and money, and that cycle has repeated itself over and over again. I heard a very wise man recently say, when somebody shows you who they are, believe them the first time. And Mr. Tyler has shown us over and over again over the last 12 years, he has pension for doing these types of things, and it's time to stop.
All right. Thank you. Thank you again to both of our candidates. We're going to go down to closing statements. Each begins a minute, and we're going to start with Challenger Constance Johnson.
Ladies and gentlemen, our hometown girl, who genuinely wants to serve this community, wants to improve what I see as problematic issues with our criminal district attorney's office. We have some fine folks that work in the office. I respect the work they've done. I respect the work that Mr. Tyler has done. I just respectfully disagree about the direction it is going. If you give me the chance, I can assure you that ego will never play a part in my office, that I will work hard to serve the citizens of this community, to protect you, but also to make common sense decisions about how we run the office. I look forward to your support. I look forward to serving you. Thank you for voting for me, our office.
All right. Mr. Coward.
If you go to the DA's race in Dallas, you look at the platform that's there, the questionnaire by the ACLU. All of the diversion programs that she's touting is the ACLU platform. What is odd is that she's running as a Republican. Fresh eyes, no matter. The case was dismissed by Judge Williams, and I think he's 3 or 4 generations in this jurisdiction. Vindictive, no matter. No matter. In the history of vindictive prosecution, I would not be the first accused in this jurisdiction, but I would probably be the least apt. She has never prosecuted a single case. She has a dozen misdemeanor DWI cases. Is she going to keep the gangs out of town? Is she going to look those guys in the eyes, and are they going to be scared of her? Are they going to stop what they're doing? Will they take it seriously? Because after all, I'm hired to protect you and uphold the law. Now, she talked about ethics. I want you to know that there are 3 ethics decisions.
We're out of time.
541, 132,